The vault of the Securitas depot in Tonebridge was an impenetrable fortress designed to hold the wealth of a nation. Yet on the morning of February 22, 2006, the heavy steel doors stood wide open. Inside the colossal cash processing center, an eerie silence replaced the usual hum of financial machinery. A staggering £53 million sterling had vanished into the freezing winter air overnight. This was not a petty smash-and-grab operation executed by desperate street thugs. The sheer physical volume of £53 million in mixed banknotes is practically incomprehensible to the average citizen. It amounts to multiple tons of highly secure paper currency that requires heavy logistics to transport. The missing cash represented the largest single robbery in the long and bloody history of the United Kingdom. Detectives arriving at the desolate compound expected to find a war zone littered with shattered glass and spent bullet casings. They anticipated the chaotic aftermath of a heavily armed paramilitary assault unit breaching the concrete perimeter. Instead, they found 14 traumatized employees tightly bound and locked securely inside a metallic cage. The fortress had been completely gutted without a single explosive charge being detonated or a single alarm triggered. The flawless execution of the heist left seasoned federal investigators entirely baffled and scrambling for immediate answers. The facility was rigged with state-of-the-art motion sensors and interconnected optical lasers meant to detect a falling leaf. To bypass these draconian measures required an unprecedented level of sophisticated insider knowledge and psychological manipulation. The masterminds behind this cinematic operation had recognized a fundamental truth about corporate security systems. Every digital firewall and reinforced titanium lock eventually relies on a human being with a beating heart and a vulnerable mind. The true genesis of this monumental theft did not begin with a crowbar prying open a steel door. It started hours earlier, on a desolate stretch of asphalt, winding through the dark rural countryside of Kent. It began with the targeted abduction of a man named Colin Dixon. Colin Dixon was the respected manager of the Tonbridge depot who held the ultimate keys to the kingdom. He was driving his silver sedan home after a remarkably ordinary day of overseeing mountains of untraceable currency. The winding country roads were enveloped in a thick evening mist that swallowed the headlights of passing vehicles. He glanced in his rearview mirror and noticed the unmistakable flash of emergency blue lights. An unmarked police vehicle aggressively tailed his bumper, signaling for him to pull over to the dark shoulder of the road. Colin dutifully engaged his indicator and brought his car to a complete halt against the damp grass. He rolled down his window, expecting a routine traffic stop or perhaps a warning about a broken taillight. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that his life was about to shatter. A man wearing a high-visibility police jacket and a peaked cap approached the driver's side window with absolute authority. The officer politely asked Colin to step out of the vehicle to answer a few standard procedural questions. The manager complied without hesitation, respecting the uniform and trusting the established rule of law. It was a fatal miscalculation orchestrated by men who viewed trust as an exploitable weakness. The moment Colin stepped onto the cold asphalt, the illusion of law enforcement instantly dissolved into a violent nightmare. He was violently shoved against the side of the car, his arms twisted brutally behind his back and tightly restrained. The fake officer dragged him toward the unmarked vehicle and threw him aggressively into the cramped back seat. The terrified manager realized too late that these men were not protecting the public. The cold steel barrel of a heavy-caliber handgun was pressed firmly against the back of his trembling neck. His captors remained chillingly calm, speaking in hushed and calculated tones that betrayed a deep level of professional experience. They informed him that he was now a high-value hostage in a carefully choreographed financial extraction mission. The armed men knew his name, his daily schedule, and his exact security clearance. The terrifying precision of their intelligence gathering became immediately apparent as the dark vehicle sped away into the night. They casually mentioned the precise address of his suburban home and the names of his beloved family members. The ruthless syndicate had not just targeted the manager of the vault, they had targeted his entire world. The mastermind had secured the ultimate leverage required to unlock £53 million. While Colin Dixon stared into the abyss of a loaded weapon, another tactical team was simultaneously moving into position. The entire operation was a meticulously synchronized ballet of terror and deception designed to cripple the banking infrastructure. The gang had spent grueling months analyzing every vulnerability of the Securitas depot, waiting patiently for this exact night. The greatest heist in British history was officially in motion, fueled by boundless greed. The terrifying abduction of Colin Dixon was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was the explosive climax of a meticulously crafted blueprint that had been quietly developing for several months. The criminal syndicate behind this operation understood a fundamental truth about modern security. You do not attack the strongest point of a fortress. You find the weakest link. The Securitas depot in Tonbridge was an absolute masterpiece of modern defensive engineering. The facility boasted heavily reinforced concrete walls and multiple layers of digital access controls. Trying to breach the compound with brute force or traditional explosives would have been a suicide mission. The mastermind behind the crew knew that defeating the technology required bypassing it entirely. To conquer an impenetrable fortress, the gang needed someone already standing comfortably inside the walls. They systematically recruited a disillusioned employee working directly within the cash processing center. This insider was a seemingly invisible worker who blended perfectly into the background of the daily operations. He was the perfect Trojan horse, carrying the eyes and ears of the syndicate directly into the vault. The mole was tasked with a highly dangerous mission that required nerves of absolute steel. He smuggled a miniature camera into the highly secure facility by strapping it directly to his body. For weeks, he secretly recorded the intricate layout of the digital security checkpoints and the precise locations of the surveillance cameras. He mapped out the entire floor plan. The syndicate studied this smuggled footage with the intense dedication of military generals planning a major invasion. They realized that even with the internal layout mapped, they still lacked the high-level digital clearances required to open the main vault doors. They needed a skeleton key, and that key was the living, breathing manager of the depot. Colin Dixon became the unwitting subject of an intense and chilling surveillance operation. The gang tracked his daily commute, studying his predictable routes and documenting the exact times he left the secure compound. They identified his quiet suburban home and gathered terrifyingly precise intelligence regarding his wife and young child. The manager was completely blind to the predators circling his family. The master plan was incredibly dark and relied entirely on the deployment of psychological torture. The criminals understood that no amount of corporate loyalty could withstand the threat of losing a loved one. They would not need to torture the manager physically or hack his computer terminals. They simply had to hold the lives of his family entirely in their hands. They acquired a fleet of vehicles, including a heavy goods lorry capable of transporting massive tons of physical currency. They forged police uniforms and modified civilian cars to perfectly mimic unmarked law enforcement interceptors. They transformed an isolated rural farm into a temporary holding cell for their designated hostages. Every single detail was rehearsed until it became a lethal reflex. As the sun set on the cold evening of February 21st, the trap was finally set into motion. The syndicate members donned their synthetic police disguises and loaded their heavy weapons. They were no longer street thugs. They had transformed into an elite tactical unit hunting a very specific prey. The countdown to the £53 million prize had begun. The false police lights flashing in the cold mist marked the flawless execution of their predatory research. The gang had successfully exploited the ultimate vulnerability of the security system. They had captured the human heart that controlled the steel doors. The quiet manager was about to lead an army of thieves straight into the belly of the beast. The heavy steel gates of the Securitas depot loomed in the darkness of the freezing February night. Colin Dixon sat paralyzed in the passenger seat of the fake police vehicle, a cold weapon pressed firmly against his ribs. The ruthless men controlling him wore synthetic masks and dark tactical gear that offered zero comfort. He was forced to use his supreme executive clearance to command the night shift security guards to open the massive exterior barricades. Once the armored vehicle breached the secure perimeter, the terrifying illusion of law enforcement instantly vanished. Heavily armed men poured out of the transport, moving with blinding speed and terrifying military precision. They stormed the central control room, easily overwhelming the skeleton crew of night shift workers, who were entirely unprepared for a tactical assault. 14 innocent employees were brutally shoved to the cold concrete floor, their hands and ankles tightly bound with industrial zip ties. The helpless workers were shoved into empty cash cages, their faces pressed against the freezing metal bars. Colin Dixon stood trembling before the immense vault doors, completely broken by the overwhelming psychological weight of the situation. He knew that his beloved wife and young child were currently being held hostage at gunpoint in a desolate farmhouse miles away. The criminals had made it abundantly clear that any hesitation or act of heroism would result in immediate executions. With a heavy heart and trembling fingers, the defeated manager approached the digital keypad that guarded the wealth of the nation. He entered the master codes and engaged the heavy mechanical tumblers, effectively surrendering the impregnable fortress to the ruthless syndicate. The colossal steel door groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in harsh fluorescent light. Inside sat towering mountains of freshly minted currency, completely defenseless against the predatory invaders. The sheer physical volume of the stolen wealth was practically incomprehensible to the human eye. The criminals were staring at row upon row of tightly packed pallets, containing brand new 20-pound notes that had never even entered public circulation. This was untraceable paper gold, stacked high enough to touch the high ceiling of the secure facility. The mastermind quickly ordered his tactical team to begin the grueling physical labor of moving the massive fortune. The ensuing operation was a frantic blur of adrenaline and heavy lifting that lasted for several agonizing hours. The gang brought a massive white heavy goods vehicle into the loading bay to serve as their primary getaway transport. They aggressively operated industrial forklifts and pallet jacks, systematically emptying the massive vault of its most valuable contents. Every single minute spent inside the compromised facility exponentially increased their terrifying risk of being discovered by passing police patrols. Sweat poured down the faces of the masked thieves as they violently hurled heavy bundles of cash into the cavernous rear of the truck. They were stealing money faster than they could possibly count it, driven by an intoxicating mixture of extreme anxiety and boundless greed. They eventually reached a critical point where the massive suspension of the getaway vehicle began to visibly groan under the immense weight. The truck was practically overflowing with 53 million pounds. They were forced to leave millions of pounds behind, simply because they physically lacked the space to transport another single banknote. The masked leader slammed the heavy rear doors of the overloaded transport shut, locking away the greatest financial prize in modern British history. They issued one final chilling warning to the captive employees, locked inside the freezing cash cages. They explicitly threatened to slaughter the kidnapped family if anyone dared to trigger the police alarms too soon. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, shattering the tense silence of the violated compound. The massive white truck slowly rolled out of the secure gates and vanished into the thick winter fog, carrying a staggering fortune that defied all logic. Back inside the desolate vault, the terrified hostages remained frozen in absolute silence, waiting desperately for the sunrise. The flawless execution was complete, but the chaotic nightmare of laundering the stolen millions was just beginning. The freezing dawn finally broke over the terrified hostages trapped inside the metal cages of the Tonbridge depot. One resourceful employee desperately managed to free himself from his tight restraints and immediately triggered the central emergency alarm. The ensuing response from the Kent police force was absolutely explosive and unprecedented in modern history. Heavily armed tactical units swarmed the compromised facility, while frantic dispatchers initiated a massive nationwide manhunt. Detectives walking into the desolate vault were immediately struck by the sheer physical absence of the stolen wealth. They realized they were not hunting a few men with duffel bags, but an organized syndicate transporting tons of paper. A colossal dragnet was quickly cast across the entire country, freezing major transit hubs and closing international ports. The sheer magnitude of the 53 million pound theft demanded an overwhelming and immediate federal response. Meanwhile, the victorious criminals were rapidly discovering the crippling reality of stealing such an astronomical volume of physical currency. 53 million pounds is not merely a number on a digital banking screen, but a massive logistical nightmare. You cannot simply walk into a local bank and deposit thousands of uncirculated 20-pound notes without triggering immediate federal flags. The sheer physical weight of their prize was rapidly transforming into a suffocating anchor. The syndicate scrambled to divide the enormous mountain of cash and obscure their digital footprints across the rural countryside. However, the intense pressure of the national manhunt caused the formerly disciplined crew to make fatal and sloppy mistakes. A massive white heavy goods vehicle matching the description of the getaway transport was soon discovered abandoned at a desolate rural farm. The criminals had desperately attempted to clean the interior but left behind microscopic doom. Forensic teams descended upon the abandoned truck like a swarm of microscopic predators, hunting for the smallest biological anomalies. They meticulously gathered discarded synthetic masks, weapons, and the heavy industrial zip ties used to restrain the innocent hostages. The brilliant masterminds had managed to bypass state-of-the-art digital lasers, but failed to account for basic human biology. Minute traces of sweat and stray hairs were carefully extracted and sent straight to the federal laboratories. The digital dragnet also began tightening around the compromised employee who had acted as the crucial Trojan horse. Detectives relentlessly interrogated the surviving staff and quickly noticed glaring inconsistencies in the behavior of the designated insider. His sudden influx of nervous energy and frantic attempts to distance himself from the immediate aftermath proved incredibly suspicious. The invisible worker who had perfectly mapped the fortress was rapidly crumbling under the intense weight of standard police interrogation. As the forensic evidence began linking specific biological markers to known criminal associates, sheer panic erupted within the syndicate. The unbreakable bond of the professional crew violently fractured as paranoia infected every single interaction between the gang members. They realized the massive police presence made it entirely impossible to move or spend the staggering fortune they had risked everything to steal. The glorious dream of unlimited wealth was rapidly devolving into a claustrophobic nightmare of survival. Heavily armed police units began executing synchronized raids across multiple properties linked to the identified suspects. Doors were violently smashed off their hinges as tactical teams dragged terrified gang members from their luxurious hiding spots. The massive fortune they had stolen was providing absolutely no protection against the relentless assault of the British justice system. The masterminds who had brilliantly conquered the impenetrable fortress were now frantically running out of places to hide. The flawless cinematic heist had successfully stolen £53 million but ultimately failed to secure a clean getaway. The massive web of deceit and psychological manipulation was being systematically dismantled by relentless police work and undeniable microscopic evidence. The final chapter of the Tonbridge robbery was rapidly approaching as the remaining fugitives desperately clutched their useless mountains of cash. The ultimate price for their boundless greed was about to be violently collected. The climax of the massive police investigation culminated in a series of highly synchronized tactical strikes across the country. Heavily armed officers breached the fortified doors of multiple suspects in the dead of night. The brilliant architects of the greatest heist in British history were dragged from their beds into the harsh light of reality. Their dreams of living like international royalty were abruptly shattered by the cold steel of handcuffs. Detectives scoured the targeted properties and managed to recover a fraction of the stolen millions, hidden in garages and car trunks. However, the vast majority of the £53 million remained entirely unaccounted for. The sheer physical volume of the missing uncirculated banknotes suggested that the syndicate had successfully established a sophisticated underground storage network. The authorities possessed the criminals, but the legendary treasure had completely vanished into the shadows. The ensuing criminal trial was one of the most expensive and heavily guarded legal proceedings ever conducted in the United Kingdom. The prosecution meticulously laid out the chilling timeline of the abduction and the flawless infiltration of the fortress. Colin Dixon took the stand to recount the absolute terror of holding the lives of his family against the demands of ruthless gunmen. The traumatic psychological toll on the innocent victims was devastatingly clear. The courtroom theater revealed the devastating contrast between the brilliant tactical planning and the chaotic aftermath of the robbery. The jury heard how the seemingly invisible insider had cracked under pressure and how microscopic DNA evidence had betrayed the masterminds. The defense attorneys desperately attempted to poke holes in the forensic timelines, but the mountain of physical evidence was simply insurmountable. The reckless greed of the syndicate had sealed their ultimate legal fate. The judge delivered crushing sentences to the primary conspirators, ensuring they would spend the majority of their natural lives locked behind bars. The mastermind of the operation and the ruthless enforcers who terrorized the hostage family received over a decade of strict solitary confinement. The British justice system sent a definitive and brutal message to the criminal underworld regarding the absolute sanctity of the national financial infrastructure. The hammer of justice fell without mercy. Despite the successful convictions and the lengthy prison sentences, the Tonbridge robbery permanently altered the landscape of corporate security. Financial institutions across the globe were forced to completely rewrite their internal protocols regarding physical currency processing. The devastating realization that a highly secure fortress could be conquered by simply threatening an employee sparked a massive overhaul in human resource protection. The human element was officially recognized as the most critical vulnerability in banking. New regulations mandated that no single individual could ever possess the complete executive clearance required to open a major vault. Advanced psychological support systems and anonymous threat reporting channels were implemented to protect the vulnerable workers handling massive fortunes. The banking industry spent millions of pounds upgrading their digital defenses, while simultaneously fortifying the safety of their human assets. The terrifying legacy of the heist forced an evolution in global security architecture. As the years passed, the dark legend of the Tonbridge Depot robbery continued to captivate the imagination of the public. The convicted criminals remained locked away in maximum security facilities, refusing to utter a single word about the ultimate location of the missing cash. Police occasionally received anonymous tips regarding buried containers or underground bunkers, but every frantic search yielded absolutely nothing. The phantom fortune remained a tantalizing and unsolvable mystery. The stolen, uncirculated 20-pound notes were practically useless in the legitimate economy without triggering immediate banking alarms. Experts theorized that the remaining millions were either rotting in damp underground vaults or had been slowly funneled through sophisticated international laundering networks. The true fate of the staggering fortune might never be fully uncovered by law enforcement agencies. The missing money became a ghost, haunting the legacy of the British financial system. The Securitas Depot robbery stands as a grim monument to the extreme lengths men will travel to secure absolute wealth. It was a masterpiece of psychological terror and logistical planning that ultimately collapsed under the heavy weight of its own ambition. The criminals successfully bypassed lasers and alarms, but could not escape the relentless pursuit of forensic science. The perfect crime was utterly destroyed by the microscopic imperfections of human nature,